Hello and welcome to WOLV TV Spotlight. I'm Sean Henderson, and today I am joined by an incredible and inspiring guest, Academy Award nominated screenwriter and filmmaker Kemp Powers. Kemp started as a journalist for publications like Yahoo and Forbes before making the transition to fiction film. His work includes writing and/or directing landmark films like Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, Soul, and One Night in Miami. Kemp, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Stop calling them landmarks. That makes me feel even older than I am. So I'm
Yeah.
kidding.
So I just wanted to start today because you're returning to Ann Arbor after being a Knight Fellow in journalism in 2002 to 2003.
Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk about kind of how it felt to be back because most Michigan students don't really know that you got your start in journalism.
Yeah, I mean, this is Hollywood has been a completely second career for me. I think, when I look at my journey, one of the things that I'm most surprised by was that I was even able to make the transition. I kind of got into Hollywood long past the date when I think most people give up on even attempting to be in Hollywood. But to be perfectly honest, I thought I was going to retire a journalist. I really enjoyed journalism. I enjoyed telling stories. And I think there were a lot of skills that I picked up as a journalist that as I saw that industry contracting and opportunities for me diminishing, I started writing creatively and quickly realized that a lot of the skills I developed as a journalist, reporting became research basically. A lot of my foundational skills, my foundational storytelling skills actually translated better to screenwriting at first and then filmmaking than I expected.
Yeah, and with that, because you were talking about your journalistic background kind of feeding into screenwriting, is there any one film in particular that you feel like you used that journalistic background to help you tell a story, be it fictional like Soul or based on a true story like One Night in Miami?
Well, definitely One Night in Miami. I mean, to the point that initially I was planning to write about that story as a book. So the idea for One Night in Miami came about when I was still a journalist. I was doing a little bit of research on that evening, and I was planning to write a book about the friendship between those four men: Sam Cooke, Cassius Clay, soon to be Muhammad Ali, Jim Brown, and Malcolm X. And it was one of those things where I had done years of research and basically never got around to writing the book. And so years later, as I made that transition into creative writing, which really started with theater, and I was looking for good ideas to write a stage play, being in that room really worked well in terms of putting something up on stage. It takes place in one room. There's minimal, there's minimal set. There's no scene changes in the play version, at least. So it really lent itself well to my first play, and I kind of applied all the things I learned about their friendship to inform the characters. But the biggest challenge I had in my first draft of that play was that it seemed like something that a journalist had written, and I kind of had to take a step back and take everything that I learned and realize that I don't have to educate the audience. I just need to use what I learned to inform the behavior of the characters in the story that I was trying to tell, because I had to decide on the story that I wanted to tell about that night.
And for that movie, and play actually, were there any of the four men that were particularly easy or challenging to write?
All four were really, really challenging. It's really hard to say if there was any. I mean, Sam Cooke was the most complex one to dive into because he was really known as this singer, this musician, and I think a lot of people didn't understand what he was like behind the scenes. And at the time that I started researching it, there wasn't a lot written about him. I was really lucky that Peter Goralnik, this incredible journalist who I met, and he was actually visited the set, wrote this incredible book called Dream Boogie that was like one of the most in-depth things I'd ever seen on Sam Cooke. And Malcolm X was also pretty challenging, partly because Malcolm X had been characterized so often in film and television. And the Malcolm X that I was trying to write about was a Malcolm at a very specific point in his life that was not necessarily what I think people were expecting him to be.
Yeah, you're trying to capture each of these men at a very complex time in American history and
Yeah.
Black history especially.
Yeah, and a time in their lives. I mean, the reality is less than a year from that night, two of them would be dead. So, it's the play version is very much more so a tragedy than the film version. The play version ends in a much darker moment than the film does.
Yeah, and the movie had an expanded runtime compared to the play. What did you find yourself able to kind of expand upon for the new format?
Oh, I mean, a lot of the things that happened before and after the night. The play is real time. The play is 85 minutes long. It begins with them walking into the room, and it ends with them walking out. So anything you see in the film that isn't that was something that was a creation for the film.
Yeah, really interesting. And kind of staying on the Black history and Black experience point, you went to Howard, one of probably the most known HBCU in the nation, and that's where you kind of found your passion for writing.
Yeah.
And then you went on to become Pixar's first African American writer and director, which should have happened long before it did.
Sure.
And I'm just wondering, because you kind of find ways to incorporate the Black experience or Black history into your works in a number of ways. I mean, Soul featured that barbershop scene, and One Night in Miami is obviously very rooted in the civil rights movement. So I'm just wondering, you're able to do it in ways that captivate the audience as well as inform them. So is that like a goal you have when creating a new piece?
It's not really an active goal. It's just representing the reality of my own life and the world that I see outside my window. As an artist, it's so interesting. I was in New York the past week, and I went to an exhibit at the Brooklyn Museum for this artist, Elizabeth Catlett. She was a very famous Black artist who lived for years in Mexico. And I kind of zeroed in on a quote from her that said, "Art is meant to be international." And by international, what she meant is that good art, everyone should be able to understand it, no matter how much you're drawing from the specificity of your experiences, the specificity of your life. It should be something that any and everyone should understand. And that's really the goal that I have, is to, even if it's something incredibly personal, make sure that, there's that test. If you watch it with the mute button on, can you track the story? I love watching films on airplanes with no sound on. And it's amazing because the good films really jump out at you, how much you can track them without the sound on. And that's a lot coming from a guy who kind of like lives by the spoken word. But I believe there's like universal themes that everyone in the world can relate to. And I think as a Black man, you sometimes see people trying to other us. We're all unique. All of our cultures are unique. But I think there's this othering that happens. And I think we should be proud of the things that make our cultures unique, but also understand that there are lots of universal things. We all want to take care of our families. We all want a roof over our heads. We all want our kids to do better than we did. These are very basic kind of universal things. My world, when I do my art, is going to just be more multi-ethnic and diverse, because that's been my entire life. Whether it be growing up in New York or living in LA for 20 years, like my world is a multi-ethnic world. My world is a Black world. I'm part of that community. I live in a Black neighborhood. I went to a Black college. So I don't have to make any conscious effort. It just kind of happens effortlessly.
Mm-hmm. And I think you were talking about just it being a multi-ethnic world. I think that's also interesting in the context of Across the Spider-Verse with Miles Morales just being from a biracial family too.
Yeah, that was such a fascinating project, because the first one, I was a huge fan of the first film, and I didn't even know they were planning to do a sequel. And then I just happened to, because I was working on Soul when the Into the Spider-Verse came out, and they actually brought the film to Pixar and showed it to us way before it came out. And I was blown away just like everyone else, because to be perfectly honest, I wasn't that familiar with the character from the comics, because I grew up reading comic books, but Brian Michael Bendis created Miles Morales, and I knew the character's existence, but I wasn't really tracking him in the comics. I'd stopped reading him long ago. So my introduction to the potential of that Miles Morales character came from Into the Spider-Verse. So, COVID happened, the pandemic, we kind of got locked down, so we were finishing Soul remotely from home. So I found myself back in Los Angeles early, because we were making it up in Pixar. So I took advantage of the time and decided to meet some new people. And among them was Phil Lord and Chris Miller. So when I first met them, we hit it off really, immediately. And they were like, yeah, so what do you think of Spider-Verse? I was like, oh, I loved it. They're like, we're doing another one, right? I was like, get out of here. It's going to be so great. They're like, we could really use help with a director. I was like, get out of here. So it turned into this weird thing where Soul, because Soul got finished, but we had to delay it for 6 months. But I was working on Spider-Verse 6 months before Soul even came out in theaters. So it was really fun to see where I could take that character next. One of the things that really drew me into the Spider-Verse that I thought there was a lot of opportunity for expounding on more was the relationship between him and his family, namely his mother and his father. And the fact that we were able to kind of go down that road was really exciting.
Yeah, and family's also big in Soul with Joe's relationship with his mother. So
Sure.
I kind of noticed that common thread almost in some of your pieces.
Sure. I mean, families are complex,
Yeah.
and you want to kind of dig into a little bit of that as much as you can. It's been interesting because I've done worked on a couple of films that are family entertainment, and see, I don't see animation as something for kids. And I grew up really loving animation that I think people might consider more mature. I didn't. I think that you can really delve into complex things in an animated film or in something that's, made for young people. And Soul and Spider-Verse just like coincidentally ended up being two stories that I was able to kind of deal with a lot of my adult stuff on the screen while making a couple of family movies.
Yeah, I think Soul's got like, for children at least, they might miss the kind of message that ordinary life, excuse me, it just kind of has its own beauty to it.
Yeah, well, you just want people to. It was so fun working on Soul because the original, Pete Docter, who brought me in there, and he was the director, and the idea started with him. It started with him saying that when his son Nick was born, he looked at him, and he said his son was already in there, like as a baby, like who his son was going to become was already like evident as a baby, and he's like, "What's that about?" So it came from this very innocent place of like, are we predetermined, like who we are, what we're going to be, and that kind of snowballed into this greater idea, and like an examination of these types of films where you go on this hero's journey, and it's always kind of the same. It's always kind of like you come from nothing, all the odds are against you. You work against all the odds, and then at the end, you get exactly what you want, and you live happily ever after. And we were talking about like how that's kind of messed up, because most people sitting in the audience don't realize their dreams. And those who do realize their dreams, it doesn't fix anything that's broken in you. And we knew this as artists, not just us, but our friends are artists. We know manically depressed musicians who are rock stars. Like the people on our bit, if realizing your dreams fixed everything, you wouldn't be reading about all these tragedies of movie stars and musicians in the news. So it was like, how can we do something so that no matter what a person in the audience's life has been, they can appreciate it for what it is? And that was kind of I think that was one of the boldest things that we tried to do with Soul, is to do this hero's journey and try to upend it a little bit. I mean, I just remember the first time we screened it internally, and Joe does this big concert and comes out and says, I thought I was going to feel different. And he goes back to that same apartment. That was like really divisive internally. A lot of people like, what are you doing? That doesn't make any sense. He just played the biggest show of his life, and he should be floating on air. And I remember talking to Pete, and I experienced the same thing myself. Pete, what did he do the day after he won his first Oscar? He went to work, and they said, "Now what do you have?" You see what I mean? It's like it's just more of that, and it's just that was I found that so compelling and such a it's like, what can we do to make people not feel like losers if things don't work out? Because the reality is, you're seeing our successes on the screen. You're not seeing all the failures that we've been working through to get to those successes.
And just kind of to pivot back to the Pixar standpoint, did you feel any form of like achievement or pride in being Pixar's first Black director and writer, that you'd be a role model?
Well, I didn't know I was until someone else told me. So I think I was more shocked that hadn't happened before. So pride isn't the word that I would say. It was actually kind of somewhat bittersweet, because I feel like, really, all this time? I don't think it was through anyone's conscious effort or anything like that, but I was just really kind of saddened by the fact that it took this long. But it's animation is an interesting business. I'm so happy to see more different groups of people getting into animation, but it's just not as popular, I think, for storytellers and filmmakers as live action is. So, for a long time, it wasn't as diverse. There weren't as many opportunities for people to move up. And I guess sometimes ignorance is just bliss because I was just there because I love Pixar storytelling. I always consider Pixar like the house of master storytelling, particularly their more complicated, darker stories. So I love Up, I loved Wall-E, I love Ratatouille, some of the little bit off-kilter ones. And that's what really drew me to Pixar. It wasn't from any desire to do animation. Animation was just the medium for telling what I thought were these just incredibly elegant stories that were so universal and so mature. So
Yeah, and staying on like these mature kind of stories that you like to tell. In 2015, you were diagnosed with rhabdomyolysis, which is a pretty serious medical condition.
Right.
And in Soul, Joe Gardner has the line saying, "I'm not dying today, not when my life just started." Now, was this inspired by that diagnosis?
My whole transition into Hollywood kind of happened from that diagnosis. I mean, it wasn't what happened is the play of One Night in Miami was up. We were doing rehearsals of it in Baltimore, Maryland, at the center stage, which is the Maryland State Theater. And I didn't know it at the time, but I got the flu, and a doctor prescribed Tamiflu. I was allergic to Tamiflu. Didn't know that. Very rare side effect is rhabdomyolysis, which is basically your muscles start to dissolve and your organs fail. So I found myself in the hospital for a few weeks, and I almost died. And at the time, I was still a journalist. And I remember like calling into the office and saying like, I don't think I'm going to be able to check in. I'm like in the hospital, and I'm going like, oh, we'll find someone else. And it was just this weird kind of moment that I did channel that, I think, in a lot of my careers. And that it was like, wow, I'm going to like die. And big fucking deal was to curse, but like that's how I felt in that moment. So it was like I made a promise to myself laying in a hospital bed that if I somehow survive this and make it out of here, I'm going to really commit to trying to do my creative storytelling, my creative writing, my theater, my filmmaking. I'm going to really commit to trying to do that. So I think in that way it did inspire me, and that it kind of made me take the real dive into it full time, because up to that point, I have children. They're adults now, but I had 2 kids, and being divorced, and you have a family to take care of, and that always kind of made me choose the option that was safer and more secure. So I think almost dying from that made me do something that was very irresponsible at the time, but thank goodness it ended up working out.
Yeah,
so far.
I'd say it's definitely seemed to work out so far.
Yeah. But don't get rhabdomyolysis, kids. Not cool.
And you were saying this all happened around One Night in Miami's stage premiere.
Yes. That was 2014? It was like 2014.
Okay. And you've had some other plays come out, one of them being another historical piece, The 19th.
Yeah.
What kind of inspired the story you told in that one?
Oh, well, the photo. The 19th is about John Carlos and Tommy Smith. Those are the 2 black Olympic sprinters who put up the Black Power fist in the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City. And I always knew that photo, but I didn't really know the story behind the photo. I didn't really know much about those 2 men. I didn't know much about Pete Norman, who was actually the Australian who plays Silver, who was wearing a button in support of their movement. And the fallout from that gesture on all 3 men's lives I found just incredibly compelling. So years ago, I decided to take a stab at writing a stage version of it. And just like with anything in film or on stage, it took this long, circuitous route. I wrote lots of different versions. There were lots of false starts, but it finally premiered at the Old Globe in San Diego last year. It actually premiered like 2 or 3 months before Spider-Verse came out. So we were in production on Spider-Verse, and on weekends I'd drive down to San Diego and sit in on some rehearsals on the play. But it was a great premiere. Fingers crossed. I'm hoping that play has a life of its own. I'll always do stuff in theater. Mm-hmm. Theater is like it kind of scratches a different itch for me creatively. I love film. I love theater. I'm always going to do both. It's harder to make time to do theater now because of production. The burden of production and my schedule, but I'll always, write. Like I already have an idea for a new play. So, the wonderful thing is I can take my time with it, and in little in between times when I have downtime, I can bang out some other plays. But the next one will not be historical. I think I've kind of scratched my historical itch for a little while.
I was gonna actually ask because you also did Little Black Shadows,
Which was also,
yeah.
yes, I know that. So I'm like, yeah, I think the next play is going to be set in the future.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm
So,
going to try to do like a science fiction play, like an episode of Black Mirror on the stage
yeah,
with music, just because I want to challenge myself to doing a musical.
bit of a 180 from the past few.
I love doing 180s. I don't like to be in one place.
You were saying you love theater, and what kind of started that love for theater? Because I know writing became your passion at Howard, but what kind of made theater like?
Oh, I grew up in New York.
Okay, yeah. So
Yeah, I mean, it was like just there. It was yeah. You study Shakespeare in elementary school. You go to the public. You go to Broadway when you were a little kid. I mean, growing up in Brooklyn, I remember the first time I went into Manhattan. I believe I can't remember which one came first. My first trip into Manhattan was either to go see my first Broadway play or to see The Empire Strikes Back. So no small irony that those are the two things that I do, because those were my first trips into the city as a kid. And Broadway always loomed large. When you grew up in New York, like the commercial break between TV shows are like, see Alfonso Ribeiro and the Tap Dance Kid, Now and Forever, Cats. Like all you get are commercials for Broadway shows. So it's really exciting to go and see it for the first time, and I've always loved Shakespeare as well. So, but I never thought I was going to write theater. It's interesting. It's just something that was always in the background, kind of like music. You just went to plays and you appreciated plays, and I kind of began writing theater very organically. Like I joined a theater company and started writing 24-hour plays. Do you know what those are?
I've heard of them.
Yeah, basically you go in, you get a prompt, they're like, you have to have one character, they give you some props, they like, you have to have one character do this, one character do that, and one character like drink a glass of milk. You know what I mean? And you pick a number out of a hat, that's how many actors you get. Then you go home, you write all night, and you come in and you deliver like a 20-minute play. Then the actors show up, they have to get their lines, and that night they just do the play. So it's like 24-hour period, and you've created a play from scratch. And that was when I really learned to develop that muscle, that storytelling muscle, and kind of hone my creativity. So 24-hour plays turned into short plays where, I actually take some time to write them, but they're still just shorter one-acts, which turned into feature-length plays.
Mm-hmm. And does the Knight Fellowship in Journalism kind of help with playwriting in any capacity?
No, I took screenwriting, actually. That was what I was supposed to be studying Southeast Asian economics, global economics when I was here, but none of the Knight Fellows do what we're supposed to study. So as soon as we got here, I remember I wanted to take a writing class, and what I wanted to take was, what was it? I wanted to take creative nonfiction, and that class was full. And I quickly found out that all the writing classes were full except screenwriting, because screenwriting was the only class that the fellows couldn't audit. So if we took the class, we actually had to do it. So no one wanted to take screenwriting. And I was like, well, I'm not going to be here for a year and not take one writing class. So I just kind of like stumbled into a screenwriting class. It was Terry Lawson's. And it was quite awkward because I was, 28 years old at the time. So I was like 10 years older than everyone in class. But it was a blast. I had a great time. And I remember at the end of it, Terry he recommended that I give it a bit of a shot. I was like, really? You think so? And he's like, yeah, it was, at the very least, it was interesting. So, yeah, that's what kind of got me to first go out to California.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so kind of fate that every other class was full, I guess.
That's literally the only reason why I took that class. Yeah, I wanted to take creative nonfiction because I was still a journalist. Mm-hmm. And I love writing long-form pieces, those like 10, 15,000 word pieces that you see in GQ or Vanity Fair, which you don't anymore, but back then, and again, it uses the same kind of research and reporting, like really in-depth, really powerful narrative pieces. Again, it's a lot of the skill set transfers over to what I do, but that was what I was trying to do, and yeah, screenwriting was what was available.
Yeah. And circling back to New York, you're able to kind of work New York into a lot of your stuff. And
yeah.
I mean, Across the Spider-Verse is just set in New York because Miles Morales' family's there. And then Soul's got some like key New York stuff. Like
oh yeah, Soul is like set in neighborhoods I lived in.
Yeah.
Because when I moved back as an adult, I was in Queens. I was in Woodside. So that's why we have Joe, and basically he's like between Sunnyside and Woodside, Jackson Heights. We put him in that neighborhood because a lot of the reference photos when we were developing it, I was just using locations that I knew. That was part of the fun of it. I mean, I used to take the 7 train in to work, and the 7 train is all above ground in Queens, and it kind of does this hard left turn behind Silver Cup Studios. And I just remember always like kind of riding in, looking out the window and like loving the sun and like seeing that turn. And it was so cool to be able to like get that shot into Seoul because that was my morning commute for a number of years. Yeah.
And do you find that you enjoy anything about animated or live action films specifically?
There's some things you can do in animation in terms of executing things visually that are just a lot harder to do in live action. So with animation, I do like big scale things because they can be done and not look fake. You know what I mean? Like, so oddly enough, like I like action and things like that in animation a lot. But generally speaking, it's not something I think too much about. It's like, again, they're different mediums. It's really what the story dictates, and how fantastical elements of the stories are. I mean, obviously, if you're going to have talking animals, I'd probably rather do it in animation than do it live action. No disrespect to talking animals, live action CGI, but I like them to emote more. And the wonderful thing about animation is, anthropomorphize things, whether it be animals or inanimate objects, you can have them emote in a way that can, like, Disney perfected that, You can have them emote in a way that I think CGI live action versions of it, they can't quite emote as well. So that's one little thing.
Yeah, and then my final question right now is, here at WOLV TV, we're doing a lot of like broadcast journalism with filmmaking. What like advice do you have for just kind of combining those elements of journalism with filmmaking for any young filmmakers out there?
Well, I mean, you could never do too much research, and the one bit of advice is, as much as the computer is an incredible tool for research, it is no substitute for the tactile experience of getting out in the world and speaking to people and seeing things with your own eyes. It's something that I still do. And this is not something coming from a place of privilege, like, oh, of course you can do it because you got money. I did it when I had no money. Like, a big part of the process, when I decided to write a play set in the antebellum South, I like traveled the South. Like I visited plantations. I wanted to see what the flora was like. I wanted to get scents. I wanted to talk to people. I wanted to, do these kinds of things that you can't get from Googling it, and you can't get from any kind of online research. You only get it from being amongst people. And so I think that the tools are there, and they're very valuable. They're very useful tools. But, so much of the texture that I think I get in my work comes from that kind of research. And that's reporting. That's what a reporter's supposed to do. And it's really worked well for me, creative writing too. Plus, it's a great chance to get out and see the world and like learn some new shit. You know what I mean? Like it's good for you. It's good for you to be around different kinds of people. As a writer, one of the toughest challenges you have, particularly early on, is writing in different voices. Because, surprise, when you're an early screenwriter, all your characters can sound like you. Or you'll see someone sitting in a coffee shop just overhearing people's conversations and copying down what they're saying. Get out into the world and meet different kinds of people, and you'll be amazed at how you pick up on things and your characters start having all these different kinds of voices. So
lived experience is kind of a big thing.
Yeah, and you can do that. You don't have to be old. I mean, again, it was something I did when I was very, very young, and I developed an ear for lots of different kinds of things and different kinds of people and different professions, and it really served me well.
Yeah, that's really interesting, kind of how your experience fed into like your work. But that's all the time we have, so thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Yeah, I found it really just fascinating to learn about you and your work that speaks to me and others in such a like profound way.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
And that's all we have for this episode of WOLV TV Spotlight. Thanks for joining us, and I'll see you soon.